Awesome. Okay, so we're recording now. Just a heads up, I have a very bad habit of talking a little too fast. I think it comes from being like the youngest kid and needing to get all the words out. But if at any time I'm talking a little too fast or something doesn't make any sense, or are there any terms that we go over that maybe you haven't come across before, or you want a little more clarification, please, yeah, take advantage of that that hand feature and ask a question, and we'll go back and kind of clarify. There's also space at the end to discuss and to talk as well. So gauge it for yourself and see, when you're comfortable asking a question. The chat box is also available to you. So if you want to use that instead, by all means, use that. But yeah, let's get started. So Donovan Bailey, who is a Jamaican Canadian Olympic athlete, who's, very talented sprinter, has said, in Canada, it's racism with a smile. And I included this quote because I feel like it kind of captures Canada as a nation state and as a one large, community of people, how racism is often kind of perceived by racialized people, and that it's not so overt as it is in the United States, and it's not so clear sometimes. And it's very innocuous in that sense, right? So if someone is gritting their teeth and they're calling you a slur, it's really hard to kind of gauge your emotions and to kind of understand what the person just said. But that's a very common trope of Canadians, and specifically white Canadians, because they are the group with the most power. So I thought that was a really great quote to kind of start things off with. So just to kind of lay the groundwork a little bit, when we talk about racism, there's not just one form of racism. A lot of the times when people say that was very racist, they're talking about, a person's individual racism. And that's, your own beliefs and assumptions of a group or people of a specific group. That's both conscious and unconscious, right? So, if you are a homeowner and you're renting out your basement apartment and you actively, don't rent out to people who are Black or Japanese or, whatever, that's your own individual racism that's coming out in your own, and it's coming from your own personal beliefs of, well, this group can't pay rent on time, or this group can't do X, Y, and Z. Whereas systemic racism, which is, maybe you've heard a little bit more about it, on social media and in the news, are the policies and practices that are so deeply entrenched in our society that it supports and is deeply woven into the institutions that, make up a country. So that results in the very explicit exclusion or promotion of a designated group. So we'll go over that a little bit more later, but it's really good just to kind of keep in the back of your mind the two differences when we talk about racism, because oftentimes the words are, racism is just used as a blanket term, but there's a really important distinction here, right? You can be not racist and work in a very racist institution. And it's, really very key and very critical to kind of understand how how that kind of works together, and power imbalances, and how that leads to systemic racism. This is also, a really good diagram to kind of keep an eye on and to reference back to every once in a while. A lot of people assume that racism starts at discrimination, cause of violence, or even genocide. But most acts of racism are right here in that lukewarm area where it's really hard to kind of determine. I mean, it's not hard to determine, but a lot of people can suggest that it's not racism and get away with that. So when someone says not all white people, you're really minimizing a person's experience, right? If you're saying, as a Black woman, this has been my experience in the workplace, and a counter argument to that is, well, not all white people believe that, or not all white people would do X, Y, and Z to you. You're not giving the person the space to, share their experiences and share how that's negatively affected them. So I'm going to go out on a limb and say that everyone's either experienced some form of racism in this category, or even discrimination, unfortunately, and you've also probably been a part of it, not even realizing what you were partaking in. So you can see, racist jokes are very much in there, and I think that's such a common experience that a lot of people have, is you'll hear something that's racist and apparently a joke, and you might not call it out, or you might not have the energy to, or you might laugh along with it and not realize the deep racial issues that go behind that joke. And all of this, adds to white supremacy. And we'll go over these terms a little bit later, but white supremacy, individual racism, systemic racism, they're all kind of this larger wraparound system that's created that we're all a part of. And it's really important to distinguish between white supremacy and racism. We go back, where it's the policies and practices, because they have very specific and very detailed ways that they affect us, but they're still distinct in their own ways, and how they, play their own part, essentially. So if you have any questions about this, let me know. I know we're going kind of over pretty quickly, but this is something to kind of go back in your own time and kind of see where you've seen indifference in your life before, or minimization, or how you've seen very outward examples of discrimination in the past. So roots of anti-Black racism. Important term to note is anti-Black racism. A lot of times when we're talking about what's going on in the past couple of months recently, we talk about racism as this blanket term, but anti-Black racism as a term that's coined by Dr. Akua Benjamin, who's a Ryerson University social work professor, is the very distinct racism against Black people. And it's important to make that distinction because, of course, Black people, Indigenous people have a much more unique experience to racism than someone who's Afghan or of a different culture might have. So anti-Black racism specifically are the policies and practices rooted in institutions, so that's education, health, justice, etc., that mirror and reinforce beliefs and prejudices, stereotypes towards people of Black African descent. So you can see the same kind of terms are used with institutional racism, or systemic racism, such as policies and practices, as well as, individual racism, attitudes and prejudices or stereotypes. So they all kind of come together as a force and, add to anti-Black racism. How do we get here? It's the same things that we're always kind of talking about, or that are being talked about in social justice circles, and those are slavery, colonialism, imperialism, misogynoir, white supremacy, and the patriarchy. We've talked about white supremacy before, but it's really important to make a distinction, or not make a distinction, but to understand that all of these distinct groups kind of add up to make anti-Black racism. And we'll kind of go through some examples later, and we'll have some time to talk about, the effects of imperialism on anti-Black racism, or misogynoir, which is misogyny specifically against Black women, because those identities are really hard to take apart from each other, right? You can't say you're Black before you're a woman, or you're a woman before you're Black. And so those two identities kind of coming together and oppressing a specific group like Black women is really important to pay attention to. And how does it show up? So I ask you a question. For those who live in the GTA, the largest outbreaks for COVID-19 have been in predominantly Black neighborhoods in Toronto. And this is the same in Montreal as well, where it's a Montreal North neighborhood, which is northern Montreal, which has the highest population of Haitian immigrants. There is something like 2,686 cases per 100,000 people. So we see both in Montreal and in Toronto. Do we have a question? Sorry, can't see anything, so someone else is gonna have to take that. So we see in both Toronto and Montreal that the highest groups that are, dealing with COVID are predominantly Black neighborhoods. So I asked the question, what are some factors that lead to that, and how is systemic racism a part of this? So I'll leave that open to those watching, because I'd love to, hear your perspective on this. Does anyone have No?
There are 2 comments in the chat box, Madina.
Okay. Sorry. How do I see? Can someone?
I can read them. I can read them out loud. So in response to your question, Shabnam had said that socioeconomic status definitely plays a part in it. Terrence Johnson is sharing that today an old white woman told me to stop saying I fight racism because of the word fight sounds too confrontational to the listener. I responded that racism is not peaceful.
Yeah, totally. That's a really good point. So specifically back to the COVID-19 question, when we look at, you know, systemic racism or institutional racism, we're talking about, you know, health as a measure of, as a measurable outcome, right? We're looking at the number of hospitals within a region. We're looking at transportation. We're looking at, you know, the areas with the highest food deserts. Are there pharmacies that are open during a certain time in these neighborhoods, or are they deemed unsafe and they close early? The, you know, communities that are most hit, are they essential workers? Are they traveling to the downtown core and therefore going through the transportation system, meeting a higher number of people? All of these things compounded kind of, you know, add pressure to a community, and leads to, you know, lower rates of access to equitable health. And, you know, this is a country with free healthcare, and communities of color, and specifically Black communities, are still being harder hit, right? So there are several different ways that, you know, epidemiologists see racism and healthcare kind of compounding together. And it's that economic and social deprivation that kind of, you know, is first and foremost. So do you have the, you know, economic stability to work from home? Do you have a job that allows you to work from home? If you are an essential worker, are you able to take time off and not, you know, not expose yourself and those you're living with to COVID-19? The area around you, does it have, you know, is it near toxic, you know, wasteland that then suppresses your immune system or makes it much easier for you to catch a virus? So all these things that are, you know, multi-layered add to one specific group being much harder hit than another. And we see this, you know, quite often.
Sorry, just to add, you know, Shabnam also mentions most neighborhoods don't have the adequate resources, hospitals, housing issues to self-isolate. Many have to take public transit and thus are at higher risk of exposure. And Sahar adds, not to mention some do not have the option to stay home. Some will have to go into work to put food on the table. And then Shabnam has added access to luxuries like technology, internet, etc., and clean environments. And Terrence had also added this also is affects both historically and generationally, and generational and institutional.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are all really good. Yeah, so this is just one example of how, you know, an institution can be very racist, and it's not designed that way. No one that's a part of it says that they're racist, but it disproportionately affects a group of people and is thus racist. So we're gonna watch this video.
Joining me now is Andrea A. Davis,
I think I got the wrong video, guys. I'm so sorry. I thought I did my due diligence and made sure it was the right one. We'll watch this one for a little bit, it's fine.
Associate Professor of Black Cultures of the Americas at York University. Andrea, thank you for joining us. When you hear political leaders say that systemic racism is not the same as it is in the States and that slavery here is not the same as it is in the States, does that surprise you?
It doesn't surprise me at all, Farah. It disappoints me, but it doesn't surprise me. It's a long-standing narrative and a way in which Canadians advance this idea of an exceptional democracy, that somehow Canada is distinguished from other parts of the world, and especially the United States, by a kind of more welcoming, democracy, a more welcoming multiculturalism. But even with then a so-called multicultural or democratic society, racism still exists and still operates. And the enslavement of African peoples, the enslavement of indigenous peoples took place in this country in the same way it did in the United States, in the Caribbean, and across the entire Central and South America. This kind of discourse of erasure, if you will, historical erasure, also serves another purpose, right? Of marking Black people's presence in this country as recent. And because it's recent, then white Canadians can say they are here because of our largesse, our openness, and so there should be a certain kind of gratitude. And there's a separation also of Black people's presence from the actual hard work of creating and developing this nation, which Black people have absolutely contributed to, whether we wanted to or not, whether all of us want to participate in it or not in the same ways.
So this wasn't the video I thought I chose, but it's great anyways, because it does, Dr. Davis does talk about the distinction Canada has, especially when it comes to we're not like America. We're not like our neighbors down south. We don't have chattel slavery. We never force people against their will to get on boats and come across the ocean and the transatlantic slave trade. So our ability to have plausible deniability is based on our neighbors. We're better than the Americans who don't have racism in Canada, which I'm sure we all know or will learn that it's not true, and it's very much present here and very much alive here as well. So Dr. David Gilborn, who's a professor of critical race studies at the University of Birmingham, calls hidden racism something that's beneath a veneer of normality. So that idea that racism in Canada is done with a smile on your face. And I think that's a really good quote or idea behind racism in Canada. So how does racism perpetuate in Canada without us even kind of understanding it or really even paying attention to it? The first example of this is just using the term multicultural. Multiculturalism implies already that we're on unceded land that has never been given to us. It implies the warm and gooey feeling that everyone that comes here is allowed to be here, and everyone is accepted here, and we have so many different cultures, and you can see the variety of people. But variety doesn't always mean equality or equity, right? It really prevents us to be able to see how Canada's connection to race and racism is so intimately tied, and has such a historical connotation. So I think that's, I don't know about everyone's experience, but I know going through the education system in Canada, that was touted as something to be really proud of, in Canadian history, is that we're so multicultural. But how does that, how does multiculturalism negate racism? It doesn't, right? Another example is when we say not as bad as. So we talked about this just recently, but whenever we compare the racism in Canada to that of the US, we omit our own involvement in it and our own contribution to anti-Black racism. So when people say, well, in Florida, you have a 50-50 chance of being shot if you're a Black male. That rate is not what it is in Canada, but it's still very high. If we look at the people that are in prison right now for selling weed, which is now legal, it's predominantly Black and Indigenous men. If we look at the number of people who are pulled over in a car in Toronto, it's 80% Black men. So we use these terms, we're not like them, we're not you know, we're not like our neighbors to the south. We're a very multicultural organized company, and I work, you know, for a really great company that, you know, believes in all of this and this and this. When we use a language, we're omitting our own faults, and I think this very insidious, you know, habit that Canadians have is really not helping anybody, right? And that's, as immigrants and as new Canadians, it's kind of the system that we're all forced into, and we have to, you know, decolonize in a way. We have to learn for ourselves that it's not true. Another way that this is perpetuated is we don't even know really what we don't know. Canada has a history of having a lack of race-related statistics when it comes to like the systems that, you know, the government and the you know, the country perpetuates. For instance, you know, police don't collect race-related data, so a lot of police departments don't even fill that out, and they actively suppress it when you know, information is being sent to Ottawa every year. So a lot of people don't know in, you know, Vancouver or in Toronto or in Halifax exactly how many young Black men are, you know, pulled over. The healthcare system, you know, when an oncologist is, you know, delivering news that somebody has cancer, they don't necessarily take down race as like a factor, or they don't make a distinction for that. So when organizations and nonprofits, you know, that work at these intersections of healthcare, you know, and also like granting, like grant money comes in, there's no distinction for what we have, you know, like X amount of racialized people, or, you know, people of diverse backgrounds that need our services. So programs are often delivered through a white lens and for a white audience. And in that way really marginalizes very vulnerable people. So just not having data is a really dangerous and very insidious way that racism is perpetuated within Canada, and that's done on purpose, right? Like if you're, you know, the term that's used is democratic racism, right? If you say we believe in equal rights of all peoples, but at the same time, you know, don't have the data to back it up to show that they are not targeted, you're letting the system, you're letting both polarizing, you know, kind of existences live in one, and you're not really proving anything, right? So it allows for this very thin veneer of, you know, niceness that Canadians have, that white Canadians have, where it's actually very quite hollow in the background. Other ways is the surveillance state, right? So 80% of young Black males in the GTA area said they've been stopped in public places by police. So just where do we keep surveillances? What neighborhoods are often policed at a higher rate than, you know, than others? How does this, you know, influence the number of police officers that are in with, you know, a high school or in a mall or in, you know, a community center? Being watched and also having, you know, higher instances of violence go hand in hand, right? Like it's not just communities of color and Black people are just like more violent. It's just you have more presence and more of a surveillance state that allows for, you know, deviant acts to be caught. Also, where are we looking? Where are Black communities, and are they being pushed out by their cultural centers through gentrification? An example of this is Hogan's Alley in Vancouver, which was rather a small stretch of land in the downtown, close to the downtown east side. That was a hub of Black Vancouver culture. And throughout the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of effort to really push that community out. So it first started by just deeming that little plot of land as, you know, having dangerous people living in it, or being run down in the media. So that that language around a historically Black neighborhood gave way for, you know, policies to come in for, you know, city planning to completely bulldoze that area and make it the Georgia Viaduct. So that neighborhood, you know, was was run down in the 1960s or late 1960s, early 1970s, and was never able to rebuild because the community was just tattered into bits and torn apart, and is now, you know, a site for people going into Vancouver. So when we're looking at development, where does development often happen? It happens in racialized communities, right? We're trying to make that area better. We're trying to attract newer people to live there, higher rents, better businesses, a Starbucks on the corner, whatever it looks like. But are there Black neighborhoods, and what do they look like now? Are they, you know, policed a lot higher? Are they, you know, given the same sort of resources as like a wealthy neighborhood does? I think Canada is obviously not as like stark as the US, where it's like oftentimes just a block that makes the difference, but we still have a lot of discrepancies in terms of like power and you know, which communities have that power and are able to like build for themselves, right? Another example, and by no means is this an exhaustive list, but another example is, you know, at all levels of education, what is taught, what is being taught around racism, or what are we learning about Black Canadian history or Indigenous history? Are we learning about Canada's own racism? Are there connections that are being drawn from past injustices to contemporary systems and the ways that are perpetuated now? You know, a question that I like to ask my friends is when I was discussing this with my friends yesterday, was what year was the first year you had a Black teacher? And for me, I think I was in the 4th year of my undergrad before I had a Black professor. So it's really so easy to see like the varied ways in which Canada is actually quite racist. And it's hard to pinpoint, and it's hard to give you know, like as a textbook to someone, because there's so much plausible deniability with Canada's history of racism. It's really easy to kind of, I think, discount all of these things, right? We can look at Hogan's Alley and say, well, the community just like left because they didn't want to be part of development, or they didn't want to, you know, be part of the future of Vancouver or whatever. But it's not it, right? Communities and people who don't have power aren't often the ones that are, you know, writing history. So we have to really question almost everything that's taught to us in that way. Something else that we can talk about too is, you know, as a community and as people that are often born outside of Canada or have parents that are born outside of Canada, the immigration system is often very racist as well, right? So an example of that is in the 1990s, Bill C-86 was introduced, and that was in 1993. And it was, you know, a neutral policy in that, you know, to be applied neutrally, it would have supposedly no negative outcome. And Bill C-86 at the time suggested that an immigration official should not grant landing either to an applicant or to any dependent of the applicant until said applicant is in possession of a valid ID or subsisting passport or travel document for statistics purposes or for immigration purposes. So the idea is that, you know, refugees would have to have codified documents to come into Canada. And around that time, 1991, you know, Somalia was going through like an uprising, and a lot of people were very quickly displaced. Canada having, you know, a much more welcoming immigration policy, meant that a lot of Somali immigrants and a lot of Afghans at the time too were applying to come into Canada. And this is where that, you know, that the neutral idea of policy came into question, because what community is going to be affected by, you know, a policy that says you have to have physical documentation? It's going to be communities that come from a culture that don't often codify and that don't have, you know, ID tied to like an actual physical paper. And that was, not surprisingly, largely African immigrants and refugees that were negatively affected, Afghans as well. So to have to, you know, establish your own refugeehood and to establish your own, need to come into a country, but then not have any of the paperwork that they're looking for, is another example of how Canada's, systemically, perpetuated racism, and whether it's intentional or not intentional, has really affected a lot of its citizens and residents. Any questions so far? Or comments? No? So what about us? We talk a lot about Canada's racism and how systemic racism is perpetuated in these kind of like larger scales. How do Afghans, how does the Afghan community add and perpetuate anti-Black racism? We're definitely a part of it. We're not racist ourselves because we don't hold the power that's needed to be racist, but we're definitely prejudiced. Or a lot of people perpetuate racist behaviors or ideas. So just as a background, Frisk, Gilbert, and Gardner, in a Handbook of Social Psychology in 2010, described prejudice as the irrational or unjustifiable negative emotions or evaluations towards peoples from other social groups. And it's the primary determinant of discriminatory behavior. So with that idea in mind, I would say that we've all seen prejudicial acts and behaviors and ideas within the Afghan community, whether that's the nuclear family or extended family, or just friends and acquaintances that we know. It's such a common narrative, right? This idea that we have a very specific culture, and then no one can kind of get into it, and it's because that other cultures are this, that, or the other. And it's oftentimes our Black brothers and sisters that are affected the most by a lot of the derogatory comments and a lot of the ideas that we have. So within the community, are we doing interfaith work within the Afghan community? What space is given to Black Muslims, or is there space given? I think Frishta mentioned like the Black Muslims in a university going to the MSA and really just being kind of laughed out of there. How are we listening to the strifes of our brothers and sisters? Are Black people welcomed in the Afghan community? A story that I can kind of share is I had a friend of mine come to my brother's wedding, and she's a visible, minority. She's a Black woman with, deeper skin tone. And a couple months later, one of my cousins was like, why did you bring a Black person to your brother's wedding? And I just found it such a, awkward, to say the least, but clearly problematic question to raise, and the idea that like this person didn't belong in a space. Where I would argue that like a wedding is a happy time and anyone who wants to be there is allowed to be there, right? But how do we as a community not create those spaces? And we do it quite often, right? Languages and attitudes. So how do Afghans view Black people? Or how do we even view Afghans who have a darker skin tone? There's a lot of like derogatory comments and ideas that are behind, someone who has darker skin tone within our community. There's a lot of language and terminology that we use to describe Black people in Canada or across the world. And certainly lots of stereotypes and fears that go along with that. Another question I have to ask everybody is also, what do we say about people with Black partners? There's a lot of very negative connotations to that, and a lot of almost like very sexualized ideas that go behind that. So we have to kind of like ask ourselves, how are we perpetuating that, and what purpose does it really serve us? Another way that's perpetuated is through parenting, and that goes both from like mother and father to children, and also children to your parents. Like, are we parenting up? Are we having these discussions? I know we are now, but historically we as a community haven't been. but how are we having these conversations, and how are we explaining, you know, what racism is? Like when we're having these conversations, is it through the lens of, you know, well, Black people deserve rights because they've been through X, Y, Z, or is it they deserve it because their struggle is very intimately tied to our own struggle, and white supremacy is something that needs to be like abolished and dismantled? So even in the conversations that we're having, are the conversations, you know, like, well, Black people deserve rights because like they have historically been, you know, like, you know, the underdogs, and, you know, the reason why there's higher crime rates is because of this, and, you know, whatever. So even when we're having these conversations, we're sometimes perpetuating anti-Blackness because we're trying to rationalize a lot of the negative stereotypes that our parents have or our community has. So interesting to kind of keep that in mind too. So connections, again, are we understanding as racialized people how we're connected to the struggle of Black and Indigenous Canadians? And do we understand that it's our struggle as well, right? As like settlers in a land that's not ours, coming from a land that is occupied and that does have occupied forces there continuously for the past like 18 plus years. Are we drawing those connections? Or are we, you know, speaking as if we're a model minority? And are we, you know, recognizing the stripes of all people? So how do we draw these connections, or are we drawing the connections themselves? Is there such a thing as a model minority? I would argue that there isn't, but that's, you know, something that we can talk about in depth. Lastly, again, not at all an exhaustive list, but somewhere to start in terms of how to be an ally. You know, I think I've seen a lot of people become very impassioned in the past couple of weeks with what to do, and there's a lot of like initiatives that are coming up, and people that want to, you know, pick the brains of their, you know, of their, you know, Black friends or Black colleagues. But the best thing that you can do to move movement forward is to just take the initiative and learn as much as possible from the people who have done the work, you know, years before, you know, right now when we're having this discussion. You know, so purchasing the books, watching the movies, you know, listening to the talks, and, you know, engaging the works of the Black academics and community organizers and cultural critics who have done this really like very difficult work and who have taken the time to teach us, is a much better place to start than to, like, you know, try to go into a protest without having kind of like the understanding of why people are protesting, although that's important too, right? Another way to be a really great ally is to just discuss these conversations with your family. So discussing why, you know, why white supremacy needs to be dismantled and how it negatively affects us and how that's connected to the struggle of, you know, our Black brothers and sisters. Once you know, begin the process and the journey of learning, which is not a destination, right? There's never like this like peak place where like you'll never have to learn anything ever again and you know everything about race relations and how, you know, Black Canadians or Black people historically have been undermined. There's never going to be a place where you can kind of just reach. It's a continuous and constant exercise of learning. But as you begin your own journey of learning and educating yourself, to kind of bring other people in along with you, right? And to be able to support others in their learning is another really great way to be an ally, because you're taking the responsibility away from someone else who might not have the capacity to do it and might not have the, you know, the ability to do that at the moment. And lastly, another really simple way of how you can be an ally is to just mobilize and support when it's needed. So show up as a body during demonstrations and during protests and rallies when your Black brothers and sisters ask you, and take a back seat when it's necessary, or a front seat when they're, you know, in times like this when it's people from one culture speaking to each other and one community speaking to each other to kind of step up and share your experiences and share what you've learned. And so, yeah, organizing for your own community, right? In that sense, like to amplify the voices of the people that you work with and that you know who are doing this hard work outside of the community is another really great way of organizing and being a really wonderful ally. All right. Should I stop recording at this point?
Yes, you can start.
Yes.
Okay. Someone more? Stop recording.